As we have seen, England in 1215 was not a fair and equal society. King John's reign had been problematic, and by 1215 it was in serious trouble. John's failed military campaigns, especially his loss of Normandy in 1204, were a huge problem for the king. By the spring of 1212, John could no longer ignore the issue. It had been almost a decade since he had lost his lands to Philip Augustus, the French king, who continued to rule over them. This was an intolerable situation for John, who, like his predecessors, saw these lands as part of his inheritance and part of his kingdom. He began to plot his next military invasion. However, in order to fund this campaign, John needed to extort large sums of money from his barons. On the 6th of February 1214, John set sail to La Rochelle. The plan was that John would march northwards from his base at La Rochelle, whilst his allies, the Emperor Otto and the Flemish army, would march southwards and trap Philip Augustus in a pincer-like manoeuvre. Unfortunately for John, this did not go to plan. Between June and July of 1214, John's allies from Poitou, whose men bolstered his own army, lost their nerve and deserted his cause. John then tried to join his remaining allies in Flanders, but his path was blocked by the French prince Louis, and he had to retreat back to La Rochelle. On the 27th of July, John's remaining allies, the Flemish, the Germans, and a group of Englishmen led by the Earl of Salisbury, met with King Philip Augustus at the town of Beauvais. A battle ensued, and John's allies lost. Many simply fled. John left France in October 1215, humiliated, and he never returned. Despite this colossal embarrassment and loss, John still needed to pay his soldiers for this disastrous campaign, and to do this, he raised yet another tax. However, this time, the people of England refused to pay, and the king was met with civil disobedience. This started in the north and spread towards East Anglia. It was at some point between John's return from the Battle of Beauvais and the spring of 1215 that a document, now referred to as the Unknown Charter, was drawn up, which demanded that the king changed his ways. The charter started by reiterating the Charter of Liberties granted by King Henry I, John's great-grandfather, at his coronation in 1100. There were also some newer additions which dealt with issues such as setting limits on how much the king could tax his subjects, and setting out the broad rights of the church and the English people. By the spring of 1215, England was in a state of open civil war. Some of the disgruntled barons had organised a meeting between themselves and John at the end of April 1215, but the king had failed to appear. On the 5th of May 1215, these barons renounced their loyalty to King John, and on the 17th of May, London, the most powerful and richest city in England, opened its gates to the rebellious barons. Winning over London gave the barons access to manpower and money. King John knew he was in trouble. By the end of May 1215, both sides realised that somehow they had to reach a peaceful agreement to put an end to the civil war. The barons sent an advanced guard to Staines, and the king based himself at Windsor Castle. A regular meeting place was established at the meadow called Runnymede. Between the 1st and the 15th of June 1215, negotiations took place between John and his barons, with messengers from both parties using the River Thames as their means of transport, carrying various drafts and redrafts of what would eventually become Magna Carta. One of these drafts, known as the Articles of the Barons, survives today at the British Library. On the 10th of June 1215, a provisional agreement was reached, and on the 15th of June, both parties met at Runnymede, and John gave his seal to a draft of Magna Carta. We have no actual eyewitness account for what took place here. The surviving evidence we have are the various drafts of Magna Carta, including the Articles of the Barons, which were drawn up and then rejected on both sides. These drafts give us insight into the negotiations taking place between the king and his barons before a final agreement was reached. We know that Stephen Langdon, whose candidature for the Archbishopric of Canterbury had caused such problems earlier in John's reign, was a central figure in these negotiations. On the 19th of June, the hostilities formally ceased, and there was a ceremony of reconciliation between the two parties, and the barons renewed their loyalty to the king. Magna Carta has become an iconic document, but what did it actually say? Magna Carta was written in Latin. It's 4,000 words long and contains 63 clauses. Most of these clauses now seem very outdated and technical. They related to specific issues which affected people in the 13th century. For example, there were regulations regarding feudalism and the banning of fish weirs on the River Medway and River Thames. There were also clauses which dealt with much bigger themes, such as justice. For example, fines were made proportional to the events that had been committed. The appointment of corrupt sheriffs and officials was to be looked into, and the evil customs of the royal forests and warrens was to be investigated. The rights of the English Church were also to be upheld, and the liberties of the City of London fully recognised. Limits were set on how much the king could charge the barons and nobility for their inheritance, and widows' rights to their inheritance was confirmed. Remarriage against their will was prohibited. Weights and measures for corn, cloth and ale were also regulated. So as we can see, Magna Carta touched on a wide variety of 13th century concerns, many of which may not seem relevant in the 21st century. However, some of Magna Carta's clauses are still very important today, in particular clauses 39 and 40, which are the most famous and are still on Britain's statute books. Clause 39 states that no free man is to be arrested or imprisoned or deceased or outlawed or exiled or in any other way ruined, nor will we go or send against him except by the legal judgment of his peers and by the law of the land. Clause 40 states that to no one will we sell, to no one will we deny, nor delay right or justice. These two clauses are believed to be the foundation of English law and justice. They mean that everyone has the right to justice, and no one can be imprisoned without reason or without a trial by their peers. Another famous clause which is still relevant today is Clause 12, which says that no scutage or other aid is to be levied in our realm, except by the common council of our realm. Clause 12 laid down the principles for taxation with the consent of the people. Essentially, Parliament had to agree before the king could demand a new tax. Although this may seem like a very modern concept, it has its roots in the 1215 version of Magna Carta and is still a principle held by Western democracies today. The big overarching theme of Magna Carta was that the king was below the law. He made the laws, but he also had to obey them, just like everybody else. Before Magna Carta, there had been two rival views regarding kingship. King John and the royalist supporters believed that the king was only answerable to God. The rival view, that held by the barons and championed by Magna Carta, was that the king was under God and under the law. King John may have agreed to Magna Carta in June 1215 and gone along with it on the day, but this wasn't to last. The barons had foreseen that John would go back on his word and had included in Clause 61 that there would be an enforcement committee, a group of 25 barons who would ensure that Magna Carta was upheld. However, this enforcement committee didn't even get the chance to attempt to do their job. Between the 19th and the 29th of July 1215, under the conditions of Magna Carta, John had to restore the lands and castles to those men whom he had taken them from, without giving them proper access to justice or a trial by their peers. Over the course of these 10 days, he had to make 50 acts of restoration. John felt that he was losing his authority, and he began trying to wriggle out of making any more restorations. This soon led to tensions between the king and his barons. At the Council of Oxford, John and the barons were once again on opposing sides, and soon afterwards John appealed to the Pope to annul Magna Carta. On the 7th of July 1215, the Pope excommunicated the barons who had rebelled against their king, and on the 24th of August, the Pope issued papal bulls condemning the barons' behaviour and making Magna Carta null and void. Magna Carta in its original form only lasted for 3 months. John's rejection of Magna Carta renewed the war between the king and the barons, and by September 1215, England was once again at war with itself. John rode north in order to terrorise his subjects into acknowledging his authority. After all, the majority of rebellious barons had come from the north and East Anglia. John besieged the border town of Berwick and then burnt it to the ground. He then rode through Lincoln, Fotheringay and through Essex to Oxford, winning support along the way. However, the 25 barons wrote to the son of the French king, Prince Louis, asking him to come to England and take the throne for himself. Prince Louis and his army landed on the Kent coast on the 21st of May 1216. Rather than facing his adversary in battle, John hastily retreated. Many of his leading nobles defected to Prince Louis, and the French prince was warmly welcomed into London. It was while staying in the village of Bishop's Lynn in Norfolk that John first became ill. He decided to return to Newark Castle via Wisbech. Although John took the slower and safer route around the Wash, his soldiers and carts full of his personal possessions, including the crown jewels he had inherited from his grandmother, the Empress of Germany, took the shorter route through the marshes. When attempting to cross near Sutton Bridge, they suddenly became trapped by the tide, and they were drowned. The treasure carts were lost and never recovered. King John died a few days later, on the 18th of October 1216. The civil war raged on around him, and his young son, Henry, aged 9, became king. The issue of Magna Carta had not been resolved. Under John's son and heir, King Henry III, and the regency of William Marshal, Magna Carta was reissued several times. Soon after John's death, minor alterations were made, and it was reissued in 1216. Then, after Prince Louis gave up his claim to the English throne and returned to France, it was reissued again in 1217, this time with a separate Charter of the Forest, which covered all laws relating to the administration and management of the royal forests. The 1216 and 1217 versions of Magna Carta were already very different to the 1215 version. Magna Carta was no longer a peace treaty issued by the king to his enemies. Instead, it was an offering by the king and his supporters to the wider realm, in which the new king showed a commitment to govern in a different way to his father. The 1225 version of Magna Carta, which was issued when Henry III turned 18, became its definitive version. It was this version of Magna Carta, and not the original versions agreed upon in 1215 at Runnymede, which was entered onto England's statute books. In the next video, we will explore what Magna Carta means to us today, and how it has been used for the basis of many famous civil rights movements throughout history. We will also explore the myth of Magna Carta, and whether or not, as a document, it deserves its fame.